Hello everyone. I'm happy to be at the International Reliability Physics Symposium 2022 and to present our invited talk. We gave our talk a provocative title, The Price of Secrecy. We will tell you how DRAM vendors today choose to keep the internal topologies of DRAM devices secret. Unfortunately, this decision introduces significant practical challenges for building memory controllers that stop Rowhammer attacks. We will present a few examples of such challenges. For a more comprehensive overview of the challenges, please read our paper. My name is Stefan Soroiu, and I'm a researcher at Microsoft. This is joint work with my colleagues Alec Woolman and Lucian Kozhokar. At a high level, Rowhammer is an attack where just by issuing certain access patterns repeatedly to DRAM, you can cause unintended bit flips. Such bit flips can compromise most, if not all, software systems, including operating systems, browsers, networking systems, and so on. To this day, Rowhammer remains a significant threat to DRAM security and reliability. While mounting a Rowhammer attack requires deep systems technical expertise, once successful on a few servers, the attack is likely to be very easy to scale in a cloud environment. This makes it a formidable attack vector for a nation state aiming to take down big chunks of critical cloud infrastructure, such as whole data centers. When an attack is ongoing, Rowhammer is very hard to fix because there is no software patch. The good news is that newer DRAM is equipped with Rowhammer mitigations internal to the device. However, it's widely known that these mitigations are incomplete. Both researchers and industry have shown and acknowledged that for today's DRAM, internal mitigations cannot stop all forms of attacks. Finally, in the absence of these mitigations, cells in DRAM using newer process nodes are more vulnerable than cells in DRAM using older process nodes. Thus, mitigations are becoming increasingly important over time. This graph shows the hammer count of DDR4 DRAM modules until the first bit flips. On the y-axis, we show the hammer count. You can roughly think of this metric as the number of accesses to DRAM until the first bit flips. On the x-axis, we show three DRAM process nodes, 1x, 1y, and 1z. For each process node, we tested 3D modules, one from each DRAM vendor. We anonymized the vendors' identities as A, B, and C. One more important thing. For this experiment, we disabled the Rowhammer mitigations internal to the DRAM device. This graph characterizes the inherent resiliency to Rowhammer of the underlying DRAM cells. Once you disable the internal mitigations, and we know clever, many-sided patterns can bypass these mitigations, clever forms of attacks can bypass these mitigations, how many accesses does it take until the first bit flips? The main trend is pretty clear. As newer process nodes shrink DRAM cells, it takes fewer and fewer hammers until bits start to flip. This trend is concerning because the process nodes will continue to shrink more and more. This is the outline for the rest of my talk. Next, I'll present a brief primer on DRAM and Rowhammer, followed by a primer on Rowhammer defenses. I'll then present three shortcomings of Rowhammer defenses inside a memory controller that are due to lack of information about DRAM internal topology. We will then share some of our thoughts of why the decision to keep the internal topology secret benefits nobody, not even the DRAM vendors. Finally, I'll wrap up with conclusions. Let me now start with a quick primer on DRAM and Rowhammer. DRAM encodes data using a capacitor. In this example, the capacitor is charged, and that corresponds to a value of 1. When the select line is activated, the transistor right here acts as a switch, closing this circuit between the capacitor and the data line. The capacitor drains its charge onto the data line, and this is how a DRAM cell is read. Note that this operation destroys the value in the cell because the capacitor is drained. To preserve its data after a read, DRAM will have to write back the value in the cell. Next, I'll show how a DRAM bank operates. DRAM cells are organized in rows and columns. However, DRAM read and write commands do not directly access these cells. Instead, read and write commands are serviced from the row buffer. This means that we first need to get the data into the row buffer. The first step in this process is to activate the row where the data to be read or to be written is located. For example, let's say we would like to read some data from row number 2. The first step in this process is to activate row number 2. For this, we put current through all the column rows, and these are referred to as bit lines, and then we open the row by placing high voltage current through the row to be activated. As before, this causes each cell on the row line to drain its capacitors if they are charged. These values are now stored in what's called the row buffer. DRAM will also write back the row buffer into row number 2 to ensure that data is not lost. The data is now ready to be read. Reads or writes are only done through the row buffer. The next slides will show how DRAM works when interacting with the memory controller. Let's assume an example where we want to read the value of the cell at row 1 and column 1 right here. The memory controller first issues an activate of row 1. At this point, all the column lines and the row lines are activated, are charged, causing the contents of row 1 to move to the row buffer. The DRAM will then write back the contents of the row buffer into row 1 to preserve the data. At this point, the memory controller can read column 1 and bit number 0 travels back to the memory controller, satisfying the read. Next, I will describe how Rowhammer failures occur. Rowhammer failures are due to various forms of electromagnetic coupling effects. Remember that when we activate the row, we put high voltage current through these densely packed lines. This creates interference with the neighboring rows. In order to create disturbance on the rows nearby, we keep activating this row over and over again. When you do that, eventually some of the capacitors in the nearby cells reverse charge. This effectively flips a bit of data from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. If you were to activate the victim row before the bits had a chance to flip, before the bits were to flip, you would recharge those capacitors. Disturbance on the victim rows would effectively be undone by the activate. In Rowhammer, an attacker controls an aggressor row that is being activated over and over again. The goal is to flip bits on victim rows. This slide shows a single-sided attack in which we have a single aggressor row, row number 2, that disturbs two victim rows, row number 1 and row number 3. A double-sided attack is one in which two aggressor rows surround the victim row. This is a worse form of attack because the victim row is disturbed by aggressors on both sides. A cell encounters a higher degree of disturbance when more of its neighboring cells are activated. Finally, a many-sided attack is one that involves many aggressor rows, typically in a stagger pattern like this: aggressor row, victim row, and so on. Having many aggressor rows is what makes these attacks bypass the internal DRAM mitigations. That's what we mean when we say internal DRAM mitigations are incomplete. You can have these more sophisticated forms of many-sided aggressor rows bypass the internal mitigations and causing bit flips. So I finished describing the primer on DRAM and Rowhammer. Next, I will present a primer on Rowhammer defenses. In this talk, we are describing a very simplistic form of a Rowhammer defense in order to build a mental model of how they work. Typically, the memory controller maintains a table of counters, counting how many times each row has been activated. In our example, we have 3 rows. Row 3 has been activated twice, row 2 has been activated 4 times, and row 1 has never been activated. When the memory controller sends an activate command, the relevant counter in the table is incremented. The memory controller also maintains a Rowhammer threshold. Say the threshold is 100. This means that no row can receive more than 100 row activations. Otherwise, we have the potential of a row disturbance and the Rowhammer attack. Let's assume that row 2 is activated over and over again until its count reaches the threshold. At this point, the memory controller can perform a variety of mitigations. However, a common solution is to refresh the victim rows. Ideally, the memory controller would refresh victim rows 1 and 3. If you remember, a row activate moves the data into the row buffer and then writes the data back into the row. That is effectively a row refresh. So ideally, the memory controller could issue 2 activate commands, act row 1 and act row 3. Unfortunately, the memory controller cannot use this ideal solution. That's because the internal topology of the DRAM device is not necessarily linear. For example, the top row could be row 3, then row 1, then row 2. The memory controller doesn't know what rows are nearby. This is what we mean when we say that the DRAM internal topology is a secret. The memory controller doesn't know it. DRAM vendors have chosen to keep this internal topology secret. In the last part of this talk, we will describe some of the reasons why DRAM vendors do not want to reveal this information, and we will argue that it's now time to revisit these reasons. In this talk, we argue that the decision to keep DRAM's internal topology information secret hurts DRAM customers. Let me explain. The research community has proposed many schemes that offer complete protection. Complete protection means they cannot be bypassed by attackers. These schemes can be implemented outside of DRAM, such as in a memory controller, in chips other than DRAM devices, such as an RCD, or in software. Unfortunately, hiding DRAM's internal topology information significantly weakens these defenses implementations. DRAM vendors choose to keep internal topology of DRAM devices secret. Our work presents three such shortcomings faced by large-scale DRAM customers, such as cloud providers, who would want to implement their own complete Rowhammer defenses. In the remainder of this talk, without loss of generality, I'm going to assume that the complete Rowhammer defense is deployed in a memory controller. So I finished describing the primary Rowhammer defenses. I'll now present our first shortcoming, transitive Rowhammer attacks. To overcome this impasse, researchers have proposed NRR, neighbor row refresh, a new DRAM command. When it detects an aggressor row, the memory controller issues NRR to report the aggressor's row address to the DRAM device, which then allows the device to refresh the relevant victim rows. So in our example, the memory controller could issue NRR row 2, and the DRAM says, aha, row 2 is the aggressor row here, so I need to refresh rows 1 and row 4. NRR appears to be an ideal compromise solution. DRAM vendors can continue to keep their internal DRAM topology secret, while customers can implement DRAM protections in their memory controllers by leveraging this new NRR command. Unfortunately, the NRR command itself can be abused and can become an attack vector. To illustrate why, consider a single-sided attack. We have one aggressor row, row K, that is being activated. When K's count reaches a Rowhammer threshold, the DRAM receives an NRR command reporting K as the aggressor row. Then the two adjacent rows, K-1 and K+1, are refreshed. Let me now present the transitive form of attack. The attack continues. Row K is activated again and again and again, causing a flurry of NRR commands, reporting the row K over and over again. These NRR commands now hammer rows K-1 and K+1, creating the potential of cascading bit flips in rows K-2 and K+2. NRR-based refreshes behave like row activations, and unfortunately, these additional activations cannot be tracked by the memory controller. The memory controller doesn't know the addresses of the rows refreshed by NRR because this topology information is kept internal to the DRAM device. Instead, access to the internal DRAM topology information would eliminate all such forms of transitive attacks. Equipped with topology information, a memory controller could track all row activations and provide strong protection guarantees. The NRR command would be no longer needed. When the number of row activations exceeds a threshold, the memory controller simply uses regular row activations to refresh and remedy the relevant victim rows. The Rowhammer defense tracks these additional indirect row activations. Finally, as an added benefit, the DRAM device could be simpler because it doesn't need the extra circuitry logic to implement and test the NRR command. Let me now present the second shortcoming, setting conservative values for the Rowhammer thresholds. Consider a double-sided attack where the aggressor rows are rows K and K+2. In a double-sided attack, the Rowhammer threshold must be halved. Why? Because the victim row K+1 is disturbed by two aggressor rows on each side. Waiting to send the NRR only when the aggressor activation counts reach the full Rowhammer threshold is too late. While this is great to stop double-sided attacks, having the Rowhammer threshold is wasteful when we have two independent single-sided attacks like the ones I'm showing here on the right. For these independent attacks, lowering the threshold is not necessary. Unfortunately, the memory controller cannot distinguish between these two cases. It cannot distinguish between a single double-sided attack and 2 independent single-sided attacks. As a result, to be safe, it has to be conservative and use conservative values for Rowhammer thresholds. Unfortunately, this is another case where the secrecy of DRAM topology hurts Rowhammer defenses. Memory controllers cannot distinguish among various forms of attacks, whether many-sided attacks or one multi-sided attack or multiple double-sided attacks and so on. Instead, equipped with internal DRAM topology information, memory controllers could abandon tracking row activations and instead repurpose their counters to track victim row's disturbance. In this case, a double-sided Rowhammer attack would increase a victim's disturbance much more rapidly than 2 independent single-sided attacks. Our third shortcoming is showing that many of the row refreshes due to NRR are wasteful and unnecessary. Many row refreshes caused by NRR are also wasteful. Consider a double-sided Rowhammer attack. The aggressor rows are row k-1 and row k+1. Once both aggressor rows reach the Rowhammer threshold, the DRAM device receives 2 NRR commands, one for k-1 and one for k+1. The first NRR refreshes row k-2 and k, and the second one rows k and k+2. Row k is now redundantly refreshed twice. Due to time constraints, I only presented simple versions of these 3 shortcomings. The paper describes additional shortcomings that are more complex. The main point that I would like to get across is that these shortcomings overheads can be reduced, if not eliminated, should internal DRAM topology be made available. DRAM vendors have long kept details about DRAM's internal topology secret. We argue that it's now time to reconsider this decision. Memory controllers could provide stronger and more efficient Rowhammer defenses than what is possible today. Rowhammer defenses could be more targeted and consume less DRAM bandwidth and power. Memory controllers could refresh victim rows using traditional row activation commands without the need for a new DRAM command, saving on implementation and testing costs. DRAM vendors' need for secrecy originates from 2 causes. First, there is a belief that revealing internal topology could disclose IP information to their competitors. Second, vendors are concerned that DRAM customers would use these internal details to evaluate devices, arguing that DRAM devices from vendor A are somehow better than DRAM devices from vendor B. Neither reason stands scrutiny. An industrial DRAM tester can reveal the internal topology of all DRAM devices. In fact, recently, researchers have shown how a low-budget fault injector, a device that costs less than $100 to build, these fault injectors can also reverse engineer internal topology information. We believe it is trivial for competitors to reverse engineer each other's parts. Finally, DRAM customers will be unlikely to use internal DRAM topology information to decide which vendor's devices are best. Some DRAM devices already report timings and other information through their serial presence detect chips or the SPD chips. Yet there is no evidence that SVT-based information dictates DRAM customers' purchases today. Arguably, a DRAM vendor who shares internal DRAM topology in an effort to provide increased security and reliability would appear more appealing to customers than one who decides to keep this information secret. To wrap up, I hope I convinced you today that Rowhammer remains a significant threat to DRAM security and reliability. DRAM vendors have chosen to keep internal topology a secret, and this choice hurts Rowhammer defenses. If you want to read our paper or for more information on our work on Rowhammer, we actually have a couple of pages explaining terminology and explaining problems that industry is facing. Please see my website, whose URL is right here. Thank you for your attention.